Hi, my name is Leona Masenkai, and today I'll be reviewing a Supreme Court case dealing with the First Amendment. The case I'll be speaking about is Osborne v. Ohio, which took place in 1990. Now, to understand the background of the case, an Ohio citizen by the name of Clyde Osborne was charged and convicted of possessing child pornography. In the state of Ohio, there are state laws prohibiting the possession of child pornography. Now, after he was initially charged with the possession, he was sent to an Ohio trial court where they convicted him of violating the law. Osborne felt that his conviction was not correctly done, and he argued that Ohio state law was unconstitutional. So he appealed his conviction, which was first sent to an Ohio appellate court where they upheld his conviction. His appeal was then pushed to the Ohio Supreme Court. They heard his case, but again upheld his conviction and ruled that Ohio state laws prohibiting child pornography, specifically the possession of it, was constitutional. His appeal eventually made it all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And before we talk about the ruling, it's important to know that Osborne had three main arguments going into his case. His first argument was that Ohio was violating the Constitution by creating a state law prohibiting the possession of child pornography. He argued that under the First Amendment, it was his constitutional right to be able to possess child pornography. And he is specifically referencing a ruling of a 1969 landmark case, which was Stanley v. Georgia. Now, to take a break talking about Osborne v. Ohio, let's look at Stanley v. Georgia and how he reached his conclusion that he would use in his argument before the Supreme Court. In Stanley v. Georgia, a man was convicted of possessing obscene material, which at that time violated a Georgia state law. Specifically, he possessed adult pornography. The Supreme Court ruled in Stanley v. Georgia that Georgia did in fact violate the Constitution and that adults were able to privately possess obscene material, aka adult pornography. So in Osborne's case, he was trying to argue the same should apply to child pornography. So that was the case he was specifically referencing. Now, for his second argument, say that the Supreme Court ruled that Ohio was able to make a state law prohibiting the possession of child pornography. Osborne also argued that the way that Ohio wrote their law was too broad and still violated the Constitution. He was concerned that some imagery was to be violating Ohio state law, which was in fact protected under the Constitution. So that was his second argument. His third argument was that his initial trial done in Ohio's trial court was not correctly done. He argued it did not follow due process and correct proceedings of a court. So the Supreme Court heard his argument, took his case, and they ultimately reached three conclusions to match his three arguments. And unlike some other Supreme Court cases, their response was not straightforward for every single scenario. Now, to go back to Osborne's initial argument, he argued that Ohio had violated the First Amendment and was unconstitutional in creating a state law prohibiting the possession of child pornography. The Supreme Court upheld previous rulings and claimed that Ohio did not violate the Constitution and that they were acting out of concern for children. Now, Osborne's ruling is specifically different from Stanley v. Georgia because it had to do with child pornography and underage kids. The Supreme Court argued that, again, Ohio was acting with the thought of children and protecting children in their mind, which is different than possessing adult pornography. Now let's go back to Osborne's second argument, which was that Ohio had written their state law too broadly and it still violated the Constitution. So even though they were able to, under the Constitution, create a state law about possessing child pornography and prohibiting it, they wrote it too broadly. The Supreme Court did not side with Osborne's agreement and upheld what previous courts had upheld as well. They said, the judges, is what I mean by they, wrote that Ohio had correctly written their law and specifically differentiated which imagery of children was lewd and suggestive and therefore violated state laws. So Osborne's second argument was not sided with when it came to the Supreme Court. However, his third argument was heard out by them. So just as a reminder, his third argument was that his conviction was not properly done in the very first trial court that he went to. The Supreme Court ruled that it was unclear if the correct information was given, and so, to follow due process, they sent his case back to the original trial court for a new case, providing him a second chance. And they ruled this way such because it was unclear if the jury had all the correct information needed going into the case. Additionally, some aspects of proceedings in courts in the state of Ohio were not properly followed, meaning that not everything was correctly done the way it should have been. For instance, Osborne's lawyer was supposed to verbally and clearly state an objection, which was not done in the trial court. So to conclude, while Osborne was given a second chance in his trial court and his conviction was overturned by the Supreme Court upheld that states are allowed to make laws prohibiting child pornography because it acts in the interest of children.